In our last video, we looked at the first three chapters of Aristotle's Metaphysics book, Zeta. And in the third chapter, we saw when he gets down to addressing the question, what are the causes of substance? He first notes that there are four ways in which substance is spoken of that seem to carry special significance. And so just to remind ourselves of what these were, he says, this is right at the beginning of book Zeta 3, he says, there is no doubt a whole range of ways in which substance is spoken of, and yet four are of special significance. The substance of a particular thing is variously held to be A, that which it was to be that thing, that which it was to be that thing, B, the universal, and C, the genus. And then there's also a fourth item on this list, namely D, the subject. And he begins with this last, as we saw, with the subject. And the subject is most naturally taken to be, he thinks, the matter or the material stuff out of which the substance is made. That's what we might say makes a substance a substance. Remember, that's the guiding sense of this question, what are the causes of substance, or what is the cause of substance? What makes a substance a substance? And Aristotle initially says, well, it's natural to think that it's the subject, the thing that is spoken of, and that this is the material stuff out of which the thing is made. But we saw that once you reflect upon this a little bit, you see that this is actually a very problematic conclusion. And Aristotle criticizes this idea that the subject, which is what the substance is actually constituted by, can be understood in terms of the material stuff out of which it is made. So beginning now in Zeta 4, we see that Aristotle takes a different tack, and he goes back to his list of things that are especially spoken of substance, the four things I just mentioned. And he begins again to discuss what has become known in the history of Western philosophy as the essence. So we have this Latinized or Latinate term, essence. But this is a Latinized, anglicized version of what Aristotle describes as the what it was to be. The what it was to be. So that's what we, for obvious reasons, namely brevity and therefore usefulness, we refer to as the essence. But Aristotle's referring to this word that he's basically conjured up himself out of the Greek, the what it was to be. The what it was to be. So that it tells you a lot already about what we mean by essence, which of course is a more obscure technical sounding term. It's just a way of translating what Aristotle describes more literally and even in a certain sense awkwardly as the what it was to be of something. The what it was to be of something. And in Zeta 4 through 6, what we're going to see is Aristotle is going to give us a theory of what this thing, in some generic sense of thing, what this thing, the essence or the what it was to be, what this thing is, that it's also going to associate it with the subject. So we're going to have a different interpretation of the subject that is referred to in sentences that have a subject and a predicate. It's not going to be the matter or the material. That was seen to be a non-starter in the previous video. So instead, we're going to have an alternative proposal that the subject is actually the essence or the what it was to be. Here, however, we really start to get into some high metaphysics because it is not at all easy to wrap your mind around exactly what this thing is, the what it was to be. So we're looking at then Aristotle's account of how we fix our understanding of the essence of a thing. First of all, we can just say that remember, we're talking here about the criterion of a substance, what makes something a substance. And what Aristotle would be saying then, insofar as he is making the essence criterion for substance, is that what makes something a substance is its possession of what it was to be. Its possession of what it was to be. And this, of course, can be very difficult to grasp exactly, first of all, just why that helps. What is the point that's being made here? How does this help to illuminate anything? So hopefully this will emerge gradually, but that's the basic form of the claim that Aristotle wants to make, that what makes something a substance is the what it was to be, and the fact that it has this what it was to be. We'll see in the course of this lecture how Aristotle is going to be drawing upon Plato's theory of the forms and modifying that theory in certain ways to make this more intelligible, what he's thinking of here. Now, in practice, it's also useful for us, I think, just to get on the table right away, that in practice, what this will amount to for Aristotle is the claim that what makes something a substance is its being definable. It's being definable. So the view is going to be something like this, that to answer the question of what makes something a substance, we look to the essence. And if you ask, well, what is this essence? We look to this quality of what in the thing is definable or being definable. So substance points us to the essence, and the essence points us to being definable as we're progressing in our understanding of what Aristotle is theorizing here in his theory of substance. Now, the essence is related to the concept of what a thing possesses per se. So you remember in a previous video, we talked about the distinction between per se and per accidens properties. Per se and per accidens properties. Hopefully you recall that discussion, but just briefly and quickly to remind us. So this notion of per se, this refers to what a thing possesses by virtue of what it is, not by chance or coincidence. It refers to those qualities that we expect a thing to have simply because of the kind of thing it is. We might say intrinsically would be an alternative term for per se. So for example, we say that a guitar player is musical per se. We expect a guitar player to be musical. The second term, by contrast, per accidens, refers to what a thing really possesses, but not in virtue of what it is, rather by chance or coincidentally. It refers to the qualities that are not strictly necessary for a thing to have in order to be the thing it is. Those things that it possesses extrinsically. We could detach the accidental properties from a thing, and the thing would remain the kind of thing it is. Whereas we couldn't detach the per se qualities, because they're the qualities that a thing has in virtue of the kind of thing it is. So that's the basic distinction. So back to the idea of essence in Aristotle, or the what it was to be of a thing. This will concern for Aristotle the account of what belongs to a thing per se, as opposed to accidentally. However, not everything that belongs to a thing per se belongs to it essentially. The notion of essence is narrower than the notion of per se. So you want to keep that in mind. The notion of essence or essential is a narrower notion than this idea of per se. So we might think of it in terms of subsets. This seems to fairly closely capture Aristotle's view. Of all the per se qualities, not all are going to be essential, only some subset will be essential qualities. Okay. The notion of essence concerns something like the core being of the thing, what makes it what it is. So on 178, we see Aristotle saying, This is the beginning of Zeta 4. This is the third paragraph. The what it was to be that thing, all hyphenated, in other words, the essence, the what it was to be that thing is not the per se being of a thing in the way that whiteness belongs per se to a surface. This is because it is not the case that being for a surface just is being for something white. In other words, well, whiteness belongs per se to a surface in the sense that it's necessary for whiteness to occur in a surface. That's not what it is to be white. To be white is not to occur in a surface, even though it needs to occur in a surface. To be white is to be a color or absence of color, depending on how you're going to understand it. It's neither necessary nor sufficient to mention belonging to a surface when I'm answering the question, what is whiteness? That's not how I answer the question, what is whiteness? It's something that belongs to a surface, even though it is true that whiteness has to belong to a surface by virtue of the kind of thing it is. So the per se property and the essential property is not the same idea. To give another example, we might say it's a per se feature of a guitar player that he or she have fingers. It's something that we expect a guitar player to have by virtue of being a guitar player. However, we wouldn't say that it belongs to the essence of a guitar player that he or she have fingers. In other words, while we expect a guitar player to have fingers simply in virtue of being a guitar player, this feature is not something that it's necessary or sufficient to mention in answer to the question, what is it to be a guitar player? So in one sense, you might say per se features are in the background of the definition that gives us the essence of the thing. So how is the essence of a thing different from the per se features of a thing, if they're to be distinguished? I said that the essence answers the question, what is it to be an X? In fact, Aristotle his word that we translated as essence is just a kind of, substantializing of that question. What is it to be an X? Aristotle says the essence is what it was to be something. So it's just a kind of making into a substantial term the question itself. And Aristotle states, for an account of a thing to be the account of the what it was to be that thing for it, it must be the case that the account in stating what the thing is does not contain the very thing itself. In other words, the account that provides the essence must share the feature of a good definition, that it not contain the definiendum, that is the subject whose definition is to be provided. So for example, if I ask what is a person, I must not begin my answer, a person is a person, that, right? Because that's not going to be answering the question of person. I'm including in my definition the very thing that's to be defined, the definiendum. Now this apparently drives a conceptual wedge for Aristotle between the thing and its essence. They're not simply the same identical reality, strictly. Although obviously there must be some very close relation between them. And this is the fine line that we see Aristotle trying to walk, or the needle he's trying to thread, to use another metaphor. Now this view suggests, which is going to be borne out in what follows, that the essence of a thing is given for Aristotle in the definition of a thing. The essence of a thing is going to be given in the definition of thing. The next question that Aristotle asks here, continuing on through Zeta 4, is whether compounds have an essence of what it was to be that thing. For example, does the compound white man? Suppose we assign a term to this compound. This could be whatever we want it to be. A translator has a little fun and translates Aristotle's term by a British term, essentially for nerd in American slang, an anorak. But the word itself, this is not something to waste brain cells memorizing, because it's just meant to be a kind of placeholder term. But that's the one I'm referring to there, in case the transcript messes up the transcription of what I said. So this is supposed to be a term that equals white man. right? And this is just the hypothesis for the sake of argument. Let's suppose we use this term to mean white man, one term. Maybe white here means pale from lack of sunlight, like a nerd who spends too much time indoors in the library playing video games or whatever. But this doesn't necessarily have to function as the term nerd here. It's just signifies a term that's a placeholder for white male. So it might seem that on this definition of our use of anorak, and anorak is in this example a white man intrinsically. After all, this is what it is in one sense of definition. It's defined to mean white man, right? That's what we just said. So being white or being a white man would seem to belong intrinsically to anorak because that's what we defined it to mean in this hypothetical. We just said we're going to use anorak to mean white male. However, Aristotle points out that the mere assignment of a term to a thing doesn't have the power to determine the intrinsic features of a reality. So Joe, say, made-up person named Joe, who spends all day in the library, is pale as a result. He has very ghostly white skin. But he's not intrinsically pale. There's nothing that's stopping him from getting a suntan. I don't make him intrinsically pale by calling him an anorak. Words don't have such magical powers. Whiteness or paleness does not qualify per se as a feature of a man, though I might try to define being white in terms of being a white man. Obviously, this would be inadequate as a definition of white or pale, since other things can be white or pale besides men. So even if I try to define being white as being a white man, it's not going to work, even though the whiteness is indeed a feature of certain men. On the other hand, if I define white generically as such and such a quality of a thing, I haven't specified the account of manhood adequately. Although a man is a thing, it's not just a thing. So I can't define anorak as a white thing for Aristotle. Whiteness and man are extrinsically related. And that's the important point, that if we take this equal sign here to be the equivalency of a definition, we see that this is not a proper or primary definition for Aristotle, a definition in the basic or primary sense of the word definition. Because these two terms are extrinsic to one another. And so because of that, they can't belong together definitionally for Aristotle. So this is a very particular view. He's got this view that there are metaphysical restrictions or restrictions that come from reality in itself that restrict what kind of definitions there can be. And I think a lot of times in the modern period, we're more inclined to think that you can, define anything as anything, right? We can argue about anything. We can define any word to mean anything as long as we make sure we fix the terms. But that's not the way that Aristotle is thinking of definition. Aristotle seems to be thinking of definitions as capturing something about the actual features of reality. What sometimes in philosophy, I'm not going to write this down because I don't want to confuse you and suggest that this is necessarily the only or natural interpretation of Aristotle, but just to give you a sense of what he might be thinking of here, there's this sense of natural kinds. That is to say that, I can, for example, say that a round stone, a willow tree, and a cactus that are within 3 feet of each other are going to be called, some name that I just pulled out of thin air, anorak, right? So if I see that configuration of things, I'll say, oh, look, there is an anorak. But on this understanding, even though I've defined what I mean by anorak, now in a different way, not meaning white man, but meaning a willow, a round stone, and a cactus that are within a certain distance of each other, even though I've defined it in some modern sense of define, it's not a proper definition for Aristotle because it doesn't, this is a word the philosophers sometimes use, it doesn't carve nature at the joints. So willow trees belong together with other willow trees by virtue of the fact that if you put them together, you're in a certain way carving nature at the joints. This is a obviously a term from, let's say, meat cutting, right? So those of you who are vegetarians or vegans, I apologize for grossing you out with this example, but it gives you the sense of, I can just take an animal, put it in a meat grinder, make some kind of ground meat out of it, right? Or I can try to cut it into steaks and different, I'm cutting it at the joints. So here's the legs, here's the different parts, and so on. All right, enough of that, because I know there are probably some people who are sensitive to these barbaric practices of meat eating that we engage in. But that's just to say that for definitions for Aristotle are going to carve nature at the joints in this way. It's not going to just randomly define things into existence through words. But the words it seems like they're supposed to reflect some kind of structure of reality that pre-exists our language. At any rate, that seems to be the natural way to read Aristotle here. But of course, it is possible there might be some other ways to interpret him. Okay. Aristotle's way of stating the underlying problem with the suggestion that compounds, like white man, being a compound here in this example, can have essences, is to say that a compound like white man does not have thisness. So on page 179, this is right around 1030a. If you find that on the page, it's that paragraph I'm going to read here. He says, but then the question is whether being an anorak is a case of a what it was to be that thing at all. A reason for denying that it is that a what it was to be that thing is the same sort of a thing as a thing with thisness. And a thing with thisness is just what we do not get whenever one thing is said of another. So, for example, a white man is not something with thisness, assuming that thisness is an exclusive feature of substances. So this is the key claim here. A thing with thisness is just what we do not get whenever one thing is said of another. So the whiteness is said of a man. And he's saying that in those sorts of situations, we're not getting thisness. What is he thinking of here? Or perhaps something like this. It's true that I can point to Joe's paleness. I could point down and say, Joe, look how pale you are. You've got to go out and get some sun. He says, no, UV rays, I don't want to get skin cancer or whatever. But I'm pointing, I say, but look at you. And I'm pointing, I said, look how pale you are. Okay, well, a question arises here. What am I pointing at? Am I pointing at Joe or at his paleness? And it would seem here in context, given what I'm saying in our conversation, it's clear that what I'm pointing at is Joe's paleness or his whiteness. But it's the word that's doing the work of indication, not the pointing, right? If Joe just walks out of the library and I point at him, he's going to say, what? What have I done? He doesn't know what that pointing is meaning. And it's not possible by some mental act for me to make that a pointing at his paleness as opposed to pointing at him. I have to choose which this I mean, Joe or the paleness which he exemplifies. And only a this can have an essence. So it's the way in which, another way to put it would be to say that when something like whiteness is spoken of something like Joe, the thisness of the whiteness is in a certain way parasitic or dependent or derivative on Joe. It's Joe, first of all, always that I'm pointing to primarily, and then the whiteness only by abstraction, so to speak. Okay, anyway, that's my best shot at understanding what he's getting at there. So Aristotle would seem to have to draw the conclusion then that there are no essences of compounds like white man. Essences belong to simple, non-compound things. And from this, Aristotle is prepared to draw a major conclusion. And this is in the next paragraph there. We know it's a major conclusion because it's put in italics by our translator. He says, now this gives a nice clear conclusion. Of what it was to be that thing only belongs to those things for whom an account just is a definition. What it was to be that thing only belongs to those things for whom an account just is a definition. So obviously this conclusion raises an immediate question, namely, what is a definition? And I already mentioned that the definition is going to include the definiendum and the definiens. And then some kind of equivalency relation. So the definiendum is the subject that is to be defined. We have our example up here still, although this for Aristotle, remember, is going to be not a definition. This is not going to be a proper definition because it's of a compound in this way. So the definiendum is going to be the subject term that's to be defined. The definiens is going to be the account that provides the account of the definiendum. And then there's going to be some form of equivalency relation where I say this is that. And so all three of these need to be further specified and explained. What is the proper class of definiendums in a real definition, a real proper definition, if this sort of thing isn't a proper definition? What are the definienda here? What sorts of things are going to count as the definiens in a proper definition? And then what kind of equivalency relation are we going to be talking about? Now, Aristotle's initial answer is that a definition must be of something primary or primary things. And these are things, he says, that are said without the predication of one thing of another. Things said without the predication of one thing of another. That's found on page 80. So the definiendum's got to be primary things. Those are the only things that there's going to be definitions of. And these are things said without the predication of one thing of another. Now that idea, things said without the predication of one thing of another, seems to refer to what we might call essential properties. So it's a way of saying primary things have only essential properties. So the definiens is going to include essential properties only. Essential properties only of primary things and essential properties only. The predication of one thing of another seems to refer to accidental properties. So the essential properties would be things said without predication of one thing of another. Okay. So this leads us to our first discussion question. In your view, what's the relation between what it was to be that thing, or the essence, and its definition? What's the relation between the essence and its definition? Is Aristotle making any questionable assumptions about the relation between a definition of a word and the essence of a thing? Any questionable assumptions about the relationship between words and things? In particular, if a definition pertains to the meaning of a word, how do we know that a word accurately reflects the essence of a thing? Is Aristotle drawing too close an equivalency between words and things? So one more time, in your view, what's the relation between essence and definition in your view? Are they just the same thing? Are they different in what ways? And so on, nothing to do with each other? Is Aristotle making any questionable assumptions about the relation between the definition of a word and the essence of a thing? And in particular, if a definition pertains to the meaning of a word, how do we know that a word accurately reflects the essence of a thing? Is Aristotle drawing too close of an equivalency between words and things? Okay. Aristotle's view that primary things have only essential properties has perhaps a surprising and disconcerting result. And this is the result that concrete particulars like Socrates or that tree that's standing next to the courthouse or that horse that's coming down the trail, that these things are not primary things according to this definition. Rather, it's going to turn out that the only things that will have a what it was to be that thing will be the species of a genus. Species and nothing else whatsoever. Primary things are going to be the species of a genus. So we further specify this notion of what the primary things that could be the definienda, plural, could be. So on 180, he says, and again, we have the italics here, so again, we know this is important information. Towards the top of the page, we're still on 1038. He says, so the only things that will have a what it was to be that thing will be the species of a genus, species and nothing else whatever. It is, after all, the accepted view that species are not stated in terms of participation of one thing or another, or in terms of modification of something, nor on the basis of any accidental property. Already here, as we'll see in chapter 6, Aristotle is starting to allude to the distinction between particulars, concrete particulars, which are said to participate in some species. That tree is a willow, for example. Natural things are said to participate in some species, but species are not said to participate in each other. Of course, they participate in a genus, but the species don't participate in other species. So, for this reason, he thinks that this conception of species is the only thing suited to be a definition, or to figure into definitions. Why? Because the species contains all and only essential properties. All and only essential properties. In other words, once you've specified what the properties of a species are, the defining properties of a species, there's nothing more to be said. You've exhaustively defined the species. You've exhaustively defined the thing that was to be defined. You've completely answered the question what it was to be, for example, a willow or what have you. And that, for Aristotle, is the aim of definition. So species qualify as primary things because once you've defined the species, you've given a complete account of all the properties a species has, and all the properties of a species are essential properties. And this apparently is the reason that Aristotle thinks that the complete account of all the properties of a species is the only thing that can count for a definition, or as a definition, rather. Concrete, particular things, by contrast, do not have definitions, at least not in the primary sense. So Aristotle is not, he's not a grammar Nazi. He's going to allow that you can, in some weaker sense, define, right, with scare quotes, other things that aren't species. But the primary sense of definition is the definition of a species. And strictly speaking, then, concrete, particular things don't have definitions. Does this mean that concrete particular things don't have essences? We know a thing has per se properties and accidental properties. It would seem that a thing could also have essential and accidental properties. So why can't we define a concrete particular by its essential properties and just forget about the accidental properties? Well, a little reflection suggests a possible answer, and we can discuss this. I'm not sure that this is the only possible answer, but a possible answer, if we say, for example, that the essence of Socrates is to be a man, and the essence of Joe is to be a man, we get the same definition for Socrates and Joe. But of course, they're different individuals with many differences in their accidental properties. Man can be given a self-identical account that covers all and only one individual species, but individual concrete men can't be given such an account. And only such an account is a definition, properly so called, for Aristotle. Again, there might be a way in which you could define particular things in an extended sense, but this is the core theory of definition that Aristotle is giving. If essence, the what it was to be that thing, applies primarily to species, then it would seem to follow that it's only species that are substances primarily and without qualification. It's only species that are substances. These are the substances, the species. These are the substances in the primary sense without qualification. What do you mean? Species are the primary substances? Exclamation point, question mark. This might seem to have drifted away from what we might originally or intuitively have thought, that the concrete particulars are the primary substances, not the species of a genus. So this is obviously a good point to stop and reflect. Does Aristotle have good grounds for thinking that it's only the species of a genus, that possess definitions and essences? First of all, does he have good grounds for thinking it's only species that possess definitions and essences? And is he right about that? Is he right about that? And then finally, what implications does this have for the idea that essence is criterial of substance? Essence is the criterion of substance. So does Aristotle have good grounds for thinking that it's only the species of a genus that possess definitions and essences? Is he right about that? And what implications does this view have for the idea that essence is criterial of substance? Are we still prepared to say that given this view of essence and the implications that we've just drawn out through Aristotle's explication of it, are we still prepared to say that it's the essence that makes something into a substance? Zeta 5. This chapter buttresses and clarifies Aristotle's account of the relationship of definition, essence, and substances. And it's shorter. We can go through rather quickly. Most of it is taken up with the question, why can't one give a definition to a term that is not simple but coupled in terms of an account that involves an addition? Why can't one give a definition to a term that is not simple but coupled in terms of an account that involves an addition? And this is really, in a way, going back to this question of why you can't define compound things. But we might actually ask here, what does this question mean? Why is it an important one to ask? And both the meaning of the question and its importance are best clarified through an example. So Aristotle takes the example of snub, which is concave nose, snub. And he says, well, can't we define what a snub is? Why or why not? I mean, why isn't this a good definition of a snub? And you can see we're going back over this issue that arose with regard to his attempt to consider whether white man could be a definition, could be defined. We should get out of the way from the outset that Aristotle would admit that in some extended or secondary sense you might be able to define it, but the real question is whether this definition captures an essence. And that's always the question with Aristotle in this book. Definition in a primary sense is what we might call an essential definition, or one that represents what it was to be a thing, which has the privileged metaphysical status of substance. And snub for him is not an essence, nor is it therefore a substance. Why not? The problem, again, is that it's not simple. It's formed from a coupling, that's the coupling point, of two extrinsically related things, concave and nose. The nose in this example is the substance, or what's defined primarily. And snub is defined only in a way that's dependent upon the definition of nose. So nose, but not snub, has an essence. It's true that snub belongs to the nose intrinsically, provided that we're talking about a particular concave nose. But this is not enough. It's not enough for something to belong intrinsically to something for it to be an essence. What more is needed is described in an important passage in the bottom of 183, and continuing to the top of 184, where he says, He says, this is ruled out by the impossibility of stating snubness without bringing in the thing to which it applies per se, snubness being concavity in a nose. Then either it is impossible to state the snub nose at all, or in doing so the same thing will be said twice, via snub nose. In other words, the key phrase here is the impossibility of stating snubness without bringing in the thing to which it applies per se. The very essence, or the what it is to be of snubness, if you want to use essence in this hypothetical sense, that if snubness were to have an essence, it could have it only by virtue of its participating in the essence of the nose. Whereas the nose, on this understanding, is primary. The snubness is a kind of secondary derivative thing. Now, you could ask the question of whether this is true of nose as well. Does nose have an essence, or does it have to somehow participate in some larger structure like the face or something like that? And that's something debatable. The point is just within the context of this example, what he wants to say is that it's ruled out that there could be an essence of snubness, because we can't bring into account this idea of what it is to be snub without bringing in something else, namely the nose, that has to be defined in a more primary sense. So we end Zeta 5 with two conclusions. This is the last part of the chapter. A definition is an account of what it was to be that thing, and B, what it was to be that thing either belongs only to substances or belongs to them in the fullest sense, primarily and without qualification. So we have this connection that I said I was going to draw at the beginning there, the relationship between substance, essence, and definition, as these are defined. The substance is understood in terms of essence. Essence is understood in terms of definition. Okay, in Zeta 6 then, Aristotle further develops his views that essence is what makes a substance a substance. And that the essence of a thing is that which is definable, and accordingly, species are the primary substances. So this is the summary of the basic view. Essence is what makes a substance a substance. The essence of a thing is that which is definable, and accordingly, species are the primary substances. Now, the important question I think that's answered here in chapter 6 is how Aristotle's view of species is distinct from the Platonic forms. So this part is what we get in chapter 6 primarily. He wants to show that the notion of species that he's operating with here is not a Platonic form, which would be some kind of abstract entity that existed in some kind of spiritual dimension of reality apart from the material sensible world, and that was somehow the source of being of sensible, natural, particular things. So Aristotle's notion of species is not going to be that. But neither are species concrete particulars. Rather, they're groups or kinds or sorts of things. And remember, Aristotle still wants to preserve this idea of the thisness of substance, the separability of substance. So how are we going to preserve thisness and separability that we talked about last time when we're talking about a species, which seems to be something like a group or kind or sort of thing, and therefore something that is less closely associated with what we would tend to think of as something to be pointed to as this. So there definitely is a question about how close Aristotle is to flirting with Platonism here, because Plato's forms were abstract particular entities that seem to correspond to essences and species or natural kinds. So these are the questions that are taken up in this chapter. First, Aristotle opens with the question whether each thing is the same or different from its essence. And it seems like they should be the same, insofar as a thing seems to be nothing other than its substance, and the essence is taken by Aristotle to be the substance of a particular thing, as we've just been saying. We've seen in the last chapter that the accidents of a thing and its essence are distinct. So if we make the reasonable assumption now that a particular thing includes all of its properties, its accidental properties as well as its essential properties, then can't we conclude that a thing is, then we can't conclude, we should say, that a thing is identical to its essence. If we make this supposition that the thing is all of its properties, it's essential and it's accidental, then it's not going to work to also say then that the thing is identical to its essence. For example, suppose that Socrates is a white man. Then Socrates is different from what is the essence of a white man. The essence is one thing, Socrates is another. This is because Socrates, though he is a white man, also has particular accidents that do not belong to what it is to be a white man. Perhaps he's bald or old or snub-nosed or wise, and these accidents are not things that are part of the essence of white man. This example suggests that a thing would be identical with its essence if all of its properties were essential properties. And this is another reason, I think, that Aristotle associates essence with species, because in the case of a species, all of its properties are essential properties. There's no property of a species that is not part of the essence of it. Whereas when we're dealing with particular individuals, like Socrates, there are accidental properties, even if we consider their essence to be something like white man or whatever. Aristotle considers whether there are substances to which neither other substances nor other natures are prior. Substances to which neither other substances nor other natures are prior. And here, it's Plato's forms that fit the bill. However, there's a problem with the classical Platonic version of this theory that Aristotle thinks needs to be corrected, namely the separation of the particulars and the forms that the particulars participate in. So the problem with Plato's theory of forms is you have this view that there are two separate things. There's the form, for example, the form of the good, and then there's the particulars that participate in this form. That's what this line designates here, the participation relation. So a particular act of virtue participates in the form of goodness. A particular act of being good, a particular instance of being good. All of the particular instances of charity and compassion and what have you, let's say, or justice, participate in the form. But they're separate things. They're two separate things. And we can summarize the view that Aristotle is going to support as a view that in some sense sees the form as within the particular. And in some sense is where a lot of the controversy and questions are going to arise about this. But Plato's got this view that these are two separate things. So you can designate that by showing we have two separate things that are external to each other and the one participates. Whereas in Aristotle's view, the particular is going to be something that has the form within it, or the species, we might say, to use the other language that he's using, right? So the species is something that is intrinsic to the particulars rather than something outside of it that participates in it. And the reasoning behind this is offered on 187, which basically is that if we disjoin the forms and the natural things that participate in them, then there will be, first of all, no knowledge of the forms, and second, the being of the forms will not be things that are. There will be no knowledge of the forms, and the being of the forms will not be things that are. Because we have knowledge of a thing when we grasp the essence of the thing. But, for example, the essence of the good, if we say with Plato that the essence of the good is the form of the good, and it's separate from the particular, then what it is to be good is not going to be something good. In other words, the particular instance of goodness is not going to be good. They're going to be separate things, and so on with all the other cases. And so whatever this form is, I mean, we're not going to know what it is, because we only know the particular things, and the particular things are not actually going to possess the quality that we think they have. So we're left in a kind of skeptical position. That seems to be the line of argument that he's giving here, and evidently he regards this as an absurd result. So consequently, the conclusion is not to say that we can't ever know the essence of what it is to be good, or that we can't ever know whether particular things are good. But rather to jettison the Platonic metaphysics and to say instead that the form has to be somehow in the particular. And that's going to be Aristotle's considered view of what species is. Okay, so we're already quite a bit over time for where I wanted to go here, so we should wrap it up. Let's just ask our third discussion question. Third discussion question is, what kind of thing is a species? Is it a collection of things? Is it a kind? Is it a sort? What are those? What's a kind? What's a sort? Is it possible to distinguish the species and the group or collection of particular things that it is the species of? For example, the particular species of willow tree and all of the particular willow trees there are those the same thing? Or is there a way to distinguish them? Is it possible to avoid viewing a species as a separately existing abstract entity, like Plato's forms? How do these Aristotelian species have the thisness and the separability characteristic of substance? All right, so those are the questions about species we think about and discuss whether Aristotle is successful at avoiding this kind of problem that arises with Platonic separability. You might also want to think about the argument that Aristotle gives for this, since we went over it rather quickly, gives against this view, I should say, rather. But it's clear that he wants to distinguish his view of species from the Platonic forms and to make the form or species somehow identical with or intrinsic with the subject that we're talking about, the particular that we're talking about in the sentence. So we'll continue on with book Zeta next time.